Aaron, where do you see the movement for water security headed to now?
I see the movement for water security heading in a statewide direction, and I have a lot of hope because of that. So over the last 2 years, I would say, I've gone to like a couple of different gatherings of statewide organizers, some explicitly focused on water and some where water comes up and becomes an important issue. And there's this mind shift that takes place at a certain point where you realize this isn't just about what's happening in Detroit. This isn't just about what's happening in Flint. And you start adding the fact that Michigan's actually has like tons of injection wells, and like fracking is becoming like a big thing. And I went to Oxford, Michigan in northern Oakland County, and I went to this, I think it was an EPA-led community conversation, or it was more like a public like comment hearing about this new injection well going in. And residents were like, absolutely not. Like, we all depend on the well water. Like at one point, this person like stood up and was like, how many people here live on a dirt road? And like everybody raised their hands. How many people here depend on their well water? Everybody raised their hands. How can we allow this to happen? And like the EPA like shut it down. And which was wild. So like that's happening. You have Nestle extracting tons and tons and tons of gallons of water for like no money, no like reinvestment in this in the state of Michigan. And then of course you see like all these Nestle bottles being sent to Flint, and it's crazy when you think about like all these like ways that these organizations are intersecting, all these like corrupt government actions are like coming together. And you realize this is not just a fight in Southeast Michigan. This is not just a fight in West Michigan. This is a fight that's happening everywhere. This is happening in the UP. This is a Great Lakes issue, really. And so I went to this Great Lakes Water Summit in, I want to say September or October of 2017. And there, were folks from the Anishinaabe, groups who were saying like, hey, we've been fighting against this for years too. Like, join the fight. And you're realizing like this is just so much bigger than what we're talking about in Detroit. So much bigger. And so, and there have been Detroit leaders too who like are realizing that increasingly. And there are organizations like We the People of Michigan who are doing intentional organizing throughout the state and connecting to local grassroots struggles and weaving those threads together. And I think that needs to happen, and I'm so glad that it is happening. And I get so much energy from being in those spaces with other people who are saying like, hey, like we are in this together, and the we has expanded. And I really see that happening more and more. And I think it'll be interesting as like local organizations start to like take that into account more. And that might shift up like, who's kind of owning the work in certain places. And I think that'll just be an interesting shift over time. But again, like this needs to happen. We need to realize that this is much larger than just Detroit, and that there are webs of interconnected craziness on the side of government in a lot of ways, of these major corporations. And there's an organization called Little Sis, which is sort of a play on Big Brother, that they're a collective that do amazing research and power mapping for the state of Michigan. And they have this like incredible activity, like just really want to give them a shout out. They have this incredible activity where you basically like everybody gets like a sheet of paper that says something like the DeVos family, because they're involved in everything, or the Michigan House of Representatives, and you have a yarn and you connect who's on whose board, who's paying money to who is connected to who in X or Y or Z way, and you have this ridiculous web. They have a ridiculous web, and so now we're creating a better web. Right, a web that's actually for something and for justice. And so I'm just so inspired by that work, and I think that's really important to continue to do that work.
I was at asset mapping exercise organized by We the People of Michigan a couple of months ago, and we did a a yarn exercise
It was,
over
it was
there.
it was that one.
Were you
Probably.
there?
I don't know if I was at the same one as you, but we, the people of Michigan, have you worked with
Yes.
Little Sis. And
Star, yeah, we work with
Yeah.
Star and Gabby and all those folks. And you're right, it was incredibly challenging. It was incredibly uplifting because it allowed us to see how different goals and different organizations have really do align and sort of help build that broader coalition, both practically as well as spiritually, which was really wonderful, I think. But coalition building also has challenges.
Yeah.
And for all the wonderful things that is Detroit, there's also a lot of insularity in lots of ways. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the broader challenges that you see as far as coalition building is concerned around water security.
So, challenges that face coalition boarding on water security, and these are challenges, right, that face every other movement. There's egos in organizing, there's territoriality in organizing, and there's, when money especially comes into play, and the way that certain foundations might fund things and certain other organizations might fund things, it creates this incredibly competitive atmosphere. And so it is really hard to break free of that competitive atmosphere. And then sometimes you get a group that, steps out of the mix to connect other organizations that are doing this work, but then they start diverting some money, and it's confusing and it's difficult. And that happens, that's not necessarily a water thing. That's just something that happens in nonprofit work, because so much of this is, mixed up in this larger nonprofit industrial complex, right? And I think that is something that will continue to challenge this work, is breaking free of those. It's not even silos, because folks are working on water and still diverted. But actually, in another sense, because it isn't just about water. So actually breaking free of these issue silos and seeing the connections between, let's say, water and foreclosures and school closures, right? And the ways that are forcing people out of different neighborhoods and paving the way for redevelopment of those neighborhoods. And so there are all these intersections. And so I think something that's really beautiful in Detroit, though, is that the analysis that folks have of these issues is incredibly strong and sharp, whether or not they've been an organizer for a long time or had formal education or whatever the case may be. There's just there's a natural this is what's going on. I see these connections. I'm talking to my people, and so I have hope that those can be overcome over time. I think though also, especially if this movement is becoming more statewide, that challenges us to some degree to shift our organizing practices, because we're used to the way that we're doing it in this hyper-local sense. And I think that we need to increasingly think about how to continue to do that hyper-local work and make sure that we're still accountable and present in neighborhoods, and that folks who are getting their water shut off are front and center at the table, and at the same time also are doing this work of coalition building on this larger scale and building this up. And it's difficult to shift one's practices in that way, especially if you're used to doing work in a certain way and you feel like the fate of the world is on your shoulders and you're always busy, right? And you're not taking that time to rest. And I think too, and I see this in Detroit, and I see this in Detroit more than any other place I've been to. I see this vision of where we need to go, but I think there's a challenge of continuing to hold ourselves accountable to developing a clear, strong vision for the future, one for justice and not just against the injustices of what's happening on the water issue or food or whatever the case may be. And I think a lot of this is requiring new thinking. And I think Detroit has always been a place where new thinking is growing. So I'm not worried that that's going to get in the way. But it is a challenge, right? It's a challenge of shifting not only our practices then, but the way that we think about these issues, the way that we're drawing lines of connectivity between these issues, and moving in this direction that we need to go. So those are broad, and of course, like if you delve into the specifics of specific groups, like tons and tons of issues might come up, right? Issues of like who's accountable to who, who's communicating with who, where are the relationships held, what if somebody leaves? Like these are just things that plague issues that plague organizations by nature. And I think like organizational communication is like in general like a key type of work that we all need to do and need to strengthen ourselves on, to make sure that we're like still moving, having time set aside to set this vision, communicating this vision to ourselves and to others, and being a part of this larger work.
I want to state that I did not prep that answer. He said organizational communication, which I'm like, woo, because that's what I do.
I'm not a plan, I promise.
So, a major issue around this ongoing crisis around water security is the notion of pricing, affordability versus assistance. Whether water should be priced at all, for instance, if it is a public good. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see, what is your position on this issue and topic about pricing of water?
I believe fundamentally in a human right to water. And so when we're talking about the pricing of water, I do think fundamentally in some sense like this is a public good that needs to be provided to residents no matter what. I think that of course though we are still in, the system that we are in, it of course will take time to like transition, but I do think that's like a vision to hold ourselves to. What does it mean to live in a country where these basic rights are guaranteed? And that's not just water, right? That's food too, that's shelter. We should not have to worry about like these basic human necessities. That said, like, taking that vision, but then going back to like where we are right now, I think it's just clear that like the assistance plans don't work. Like the vast majority, like a stupid percentage of people are not able to actually continue with these assistance plans, and the city still insists that this is the right way to go, and it's just wrong. It's just not true. And it's fascinating that the city of Detroit passed a resolution, right, I think in 2008, the city council, for a water affordability plan, but it was shot down, I think, by the Headley Amendment, and like the law office of the city of Detroit, saying this would be illegal to like charge, right, in an affordability plan, you're charging people different rates based on their income. And so that would be illegal under like Michigan law to do that with a public utility. I think Philadelphia adopted that plan though, and they seem to be doing all right. Like they haven't exploded as a city. I just think it just makes sense to, if you're gonna charge money for the water system, to charge it based on like people's ability to pay, right? And the madness of the water shutoffs is that you're actually eliminating customers, right? You're not getting any money from them, and so you shut them off, and then you're for sure not getting any money from them because there's no water. So how do you actually adjust the way that you're charging people to make sure that there's some money coming in? There's a reasonable amount of money coming in. There's not a situation on people where they have to choose between rent, water, electricity, medication, etc. Right? Like it's crazy that we put people in those situations. So I think it makes sense in this moment to transition to a water affordability plan. And I think we should challenge ourselves to have the vision of what a society can look like that's beyond that, that's at a point where we can guarantee a human right to water, because I think that needs to be the case. And also, as one last note about that, the UN itself came to Detroit, special rapporteur, which actually that was kind of my first foray into water justice work, where I happened to wander into that like session with the UN. with an alternative spring break group from Oberlin College, and we're like, no idea what's going on right now. It was in the fall, but the UN said it makes more sense, and you ought to do something along the lines of an affordability plan, that you cannot, absolutely not, shut off somebody's water based on inability to pay. You know, so I think we have it in ourselves to live in a compassionate society, and this is one way that we can practice that, is by actually like allowing people to live with water, which is just basic human decency.
So, getting into the practicality, though, of the tensions and the struggles, and I think this is really where the work that DJJ does in terms of engagement and outreach with populations outside the city limits really can come in very handy, is that convincing a lot of people outside the city, suburban residents, rural residents, that they're actually paying at an unsustainably low rate for their water. And if we are to move to an income-based, progressive rating system, that basically, will mean an increase in their water rates. What do you think it will take to get people to agree to that? Are there particular frames or issues that, if we do highlight in particular ways, that the people that you engage with in the suburbs and the rural districts will be more amenable to saying, that's not such a bad idea after all, or yeah, it might be a tax, but maybe it's a worthwhile tax?
Yeah, I think the question of like, how do we convince the suburbs to adopt something like a water affordability plan or support that, it is a fascinating and challenging one. I think that there are ways that you can point to facts, of course, right? You can talk about the way that the sewage rates are split. You can also talk about the way that their cities are charged wholesale and they are paying this inflated rate, but that rate's not going back into the system necessarily, that's going to the cities. And really, when you think about it that way, it won't be as much of an increase in their bills if you find some way to actually have the cities equitably pay back into the system. So it might not actually affect residents, it'll definitely affect residents. And if you're making hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, it's like that typical conversation that we can have about taxing that wealth essentially in the water system. But I don't think it would be as fundamental of a shift in that sense. I also think when you also consider the fact that there will be no people shut off from water, and instead you actually will have a somewhat steady stream of income coming from people who otherwise would have had their water shut off. There are ways that there are fixes to the system right now that make it saner that we can do, but I think that there is this overall conversation, and it's deeper than just facts, and it's getting into the heart too. It's what is the moral obligation of living in a community, and how do you define your boundaries of obligation beyond just yourself and your family, and how do we break this culture of individualism, and we see ourselves as Metro Detroit or as neighbors across the zip codes. And I think there are so many ways to do that, and there's so many ways that that's happening right now, where people are being put in contact with other people that neither of whom have otherwise would have engaged, and that's a really slow way. What's the way to do that really quickly? I don't know. It's difficult. I know that the organization I work for right now, Brilliant Detroit, as I'm their volunteer manager, we're thinking a lot about how do we build sort of this idea of neighbors across zip codes, which I think is part of that, and how do we use volunteering as a way to form these connections and weave a tighter social fabric within Metro Detroit. And then I hear that happening in other places as well, other organizations. I think that the movement will always be to some degree decentralized, and I think that's good. And so I think that there is actually a lot happening, sort of ways in small ways, that communities are coming together and connecting. But I think that in addition to that, there needs to be work and pressure in city governments, in the suburbs especially, talking about this issue. How do we, get their systems in line with this larger system as well? And I'm not sure exactly how it'll all come together, to be honest. But I do have a degree of hope and faith that it will. That we're all going to keep on trying to have these conversations. In the process of trying to have these conversations, we'll learn how to actually have conversations. And I see it happening. I do see it happening bit by bit. But it's a long road ahead, and there is an urgency. So it's difficult. We need more people to be involved in this work, and to continue to shift the narrative, even if it's ever so small. In ways in their neighborhoods. So what does it look like then if, everybody who sees this interview or these interview series goes back to their particular neighborhood and brings up the conversation of water? What does it look like to watch with your immediate family or your block, bring people over and watch Detroit Mine's Dying? It's free, it's online, or many of these interviews too, right? What does it look like for us to deputize ourselves in our own neighborhoods and start to have these conversations? And then we can see how that builds up and grows. And I think that if we all realize that we can't look to some savior to come in and fix this problem, right? This notion of we are the leaders that we have been waiting for. I think that there is hope for this movement, but it does take everybody in that real sense. Even if it's small, even if it's neighborhood based, that's where the work is done best. So I have a lot of hope that we will do this.
Is there a story or an experience that particularly moves you, either positively or negatively, or maybe both? Maybe something that you have witnessed or have heard from?
Yeah. I would say there are kind of two sides of there are many different stories that have moved me over the course of time. I would say both negative and positive, and I'm kind of going to illustrate that a little bit more, but kind of paint in broader strokes. I would say what's moved me in a negative sense has been, sitting at Auntie Nae's house's table with her next to me, with a family across the way, and it was a mother in this case. Her partner was outside hanging with the other kids, because we always had kids running around, and she was in tears, and she was saying, "I don't know how to get my babies back. I fundamentally don't know how to do it. I don't know how to get my water back on." And when you let all that into you, when you let all the reality and the gravity of the situation into you, it breaks you, right? And I think we all get broken to some degree by really doing this work and being close to this work. And at the same time, right, we did do something. It was small. We did do something. We were able to sort of dispatch our team, and they helped fix some of the plumbing that helped actually reduce some of her water rates. And we were able to work with her and support her in that one instance to help get her kids back. So the kids did return. And we're a pretty low-resourced grassroots community center on the west side of Detroit. There are a lot of other places and people that are doing similar work to us all over the city and beyond. And I think that illustrates so much to me the notion of neighbors helping neighbors. I think that's really powerful. And that inspires me, because I think that if that's happening everywhere, we're still on the right track. We need to spread those stories. That you can do that. You can just reach out and cover your people. And I think that another thing that inspires me has been being a part of sort of these large actions around water, rallies or whatever. I like to say that a protest or a rally is kind of like the activist church. It's a place you kind of go to, and like sometimes like it's part of a larger strategy and it's moving something, and sometimes it's just you're showing up with each other. And I think that is even in and of itself, incredibly powerful and necessary. And so, going back to like moving through the Capitol with like all of these water giants and like sticking around and hearing these rallies and just these people who can just pull all of these facts and figures out of thin air, or I mean like, out of the back of their heads. Like, I don't have that kind of access to information. Like, I'm very much learning. But also that people that can fire you up. And I think I'm in this work because I've been fired up so many times, and I can still be fired up. And it's both seeing and like empathizing and connecting with like the trauma of getting your water shut off, and seeing just the powerhouses that we have on our side that can make this change actually take place. So you aspire to be like the powerhouses, and you aspire to be in community with everyone who's being affected, and you just see where you go with it.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Is there something else that we have not covered, but you want to leave us with any parting words or parting comments, or something that you think that we should be raised at this point?
I think that this is really important work, and I think it's emblematic of like the decentralized work that we need to do, because you do have all these other like bits of research, these other films that are present, but I think this is going to reach some people, and hopefully people that the others didn't reach, right? And that everybody can just be doing this work. So I think what's really powerful for me is that you're all deputizing yourselves through this right now to tell this story, and that needs to happen. Like you're a part of this work with us right now. So it's great to be in community with you.
Thank you. It's good to be in community with you too.